All right, folks, we're back at it today, continuing our discussion on the 1990s. Today, we're going to focus on sports in the 1990s. Definitely the biggest decade for sports that we've discussed this year. While sports have been popular in other decades and had grown tremendously, like sports in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you're talking about baseball and other sports are kind of growing in popularity. Then the 70s, because the 70s were the 70s, um, unless it's football, sports kind of sink a little bit in popularity as the NBA struggles, as baseball struggles, and problems like that. The 90s, we see kind of a resurgence in sports, or I'm sorry, in the 80s, we see kind of a resurgence in sports and the popularity of sports. And then by the 90s, it really blows up and starts to take the form much more similar to what we recognize in sports today. Now, if you've been watching The Last Dance, you've been watching the Bulls documentary, you'll notice they talk a lot about Michael Jordan as the seminal sports figure of the 90s, which is certainly true. But they also talk about him as a cultural figure. And, as many other popular athletes as there's been at different times, there's never been a cultural figure coming from sports quite like Michael Jordan, which is an important thing to note and recognize about him. And it tells you a lot about the position of sports by the 1990s, where athletes are now recognizable, particularly basketball players, um, because um, they're just as recognizable as movie stars, TV stars, music stars by the 1990s, right? Um, so, what are some of the things that we see start in the 1990s that represent our sports world today? Well, for one, during the 1990s, we see a great increase in the amount of money that athletes are making, and not just like regular or not just like the best, but mediocre athletes as well. Start getting these massive contracts. I remember there was a player for the Cavs who was like their sixth man in the early 90s, John Hot Rod Williams, who was like a power forward center. And they made this big deal because he signed in like 1990 or in like around 1990 a 4-year contract for like $28 million, which was $7 million a year, that briefly made him the highest paid player in the NBA, which is unheard of today. And even the idea of $7 million a year making you the highest paid was crazy. But you know, athletes didn't make that kind of money before. Magic Johnson in 1983 signed a $25 million contract with the Lakers, but it was $1 million a year for 25 years. Um, so that gave him a lot of money for a sustained period of time, but they don't do contracts like that anymore. So it shows you in the 90s, we really start to see the escalation of athlete salaries. Another big emphasis, another change that helps make sports more popular in the 1990s becomes the kind of the storytelling element of the production process for sporting events. I'll send you a couple examples in links from YouTube. But whenever they would do an intro for an NFL game or for a NBA game, there would be some kind of backstory that the commentators would do a lead-in about that had to deal with a player on the team or players on the team or the rivalry between the teams that would create more of a sense of drama for the viewer about the event that they're about to watch. And it made the sporting event, I think, connect with more people and made it more of an entertaining watch. It made it more of a dramatic type program that people are going to watch now because they want to see the outcome or they feel more of a connection to the players or to the team. The teams that dominate the 1990s in terms of athletics were definitely the Chicago Bulls, which you probably already knew, and you certainly know now if you're watching the Last Dance. The Bulls dominate the decade hands down, right? They win 6 NBA titles out of 10 in the decade. Um, they probably would have won more if Michael Jordan hadn't retired for a year and a half. Like they won 3, Michael Jordan retired. The Houston Rockets won the title the next 2 years. And then Jordan came back in the middle of that second year, and then the Bulls would win three more, so six for the decade. And everybody was all about the Bulls. I mean, there was no second most popular athlete in the 1990s. It was all Michael Jordan. Um, Nobody questioned whether or not, we argue now as to, oh, who's the best player in the NBA? Is it LeBron? Some people say like Kevin Durant, or maybe some people say like Giannis or James Harden or Steph Curry, whatever. There was no argument in the 1990s. I mean, it was Michael Jordan and everybody else. And there were some all-time great players that played in the 1990s. Um, Charles Barkley was at his best in the 1990s. Scottie Pippen was another one of the greatest players of the decade. Shaq got started. Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson. I mean, there were great NBA players during that decade. And Michael Jordan was like way above everybody else. And all those names I just mentioned, like if they were at their prime right now, playing in the NBA now, they'd be in that discussion for best player. But Michael Jordan was just so much better than everybody else, right? Um, so, but the Bulls are dominant. In football, you have the Dallas Cowboys. A lot of teams are good during the 90s, but the Cowboys win three Super Bowls in 92, 93, and 95, kind of cementing them as the team of the decade, as kind of the strongest organization and team. But you also have like the Giants and the Redskins win. The 49ers won another Super Bowl. The Broncos won a couple. The Rams, the Packers. So you have a lot of teams that were really successful during this time, but the Cowboys a little bit more so. And then you have the Yankees, the resurgence of the New York Yankees. The Yankees hadn't won a World Series since like 1978, I think, 77 or 78. And the 1980s was the only decade since the 20s that the New York Yankees did not win at least one World Series. So they won in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, and they didn't win a single World Series in the 1980s. So in the 1990s, they kind of aren't all that good at the beginning of the decade, but by the end of the decade, they're really good. And they win three World Series in the 90s as well, in 1996, 98, and 99, cementing them as the team of the decade. Even though there were a couple other really good teams during that time, the Cleveland Indians had a couple great teams. The Toronto Blue Jays won a couple World Series. Obviously, the Reds won their last World Series in 1990. But the Yankees with Derek Jeter and players like that were definitely the most dominant baseball team of the 90s. One of the big basketball really works to become probably the second most popular sport in America by the end of the decade. This is due in large part to the Dream Team, the 1992 men's Olympic basketball team that had like Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, Patrick Ewing, Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, David Robinson, and the 12 of the basically the 11 best players in the NBA plus a college guy, and they just dominated everybody in the Olympics. But this is a really important changing moment for the sport of basketball because the guys on the Dream Team were such stars that everybody that in the world that was paying attention to basketball during the Olympics fell in love with this team, and it helps popularize the sport of basketball around the world, particularly in Europe. And this is where we start to see the big influx of European basketball players that start making their way to the NBA. And nowadays, there's so many of them. Giannis is from Greece. He's technically, I guess, kind of a European player. Luka Doncic, Dirk Nowitzki, guys from earlier like Tony Kukoc or Dino Raja or people like that, Arvydas Sabonis. So lots of great players come from international as well. Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker were international players. And they credit their love of basketball to the 1992 Dream Team. So these guys become these huge ambassadors of the game of basketball and really do a lot to build the game up around the world. course, the other big moment for the NBA for basketball comes early in the decade with the announcement of Magic Johnson having acquired the AIDS virus, in which he gave this big speech and um, announced he was going to retire from basketball, and then became a spokesman for research and awareness for HIV. So that was the other big moment. So when you're talking about biggest basketball moments of the decade, Michael Jordan retiring, the Dream Team, Magic Johnson, and AIDS. Another big moment was the 1994 baseball strike. The first time since the very first World Series in 1903 that we had no World Series. On April 11th, I want to say, I could be wrong about the date. I'm not April 11th, I'm sorry. Around August 11th, 1994, the players went on strike. And sports have strikes from time to time, but we never had a strike that ended a season. And this is the only time, or the first time, there would be the NHL would lock out in 2004 or 5 for a whole season, so there'd be no NHL that year. But in 1994, the players went on strike in August, and um, they never resumed play that season. In fact, they didn't resume play till late April the following season, and it was it's been the only year from 1903 to the present in which we didn't have a World Series. Hopefully that trend doesn't continue into this year. That hurt baseball. It really hurt the popularity of baseball, as a lot of fans felt that the athletes and the owners and everybody was greedy, that they took this game away from everybody. It would take a few years to help baseball to kind of regain popularity. Another big moment in sports really comes in 1996. 1996 was a pivotal year for women's sports. In 1996, we see the beginning of the WNBA, which is one of the most important, which is a big moment for women's athletics. And we also see the 1996 women's gymnastics team, the Magnificent Seven, as they're called, win the gold medal in gymnastics in 1996. This is a big moment because the United States had never won a gold medal in this Olympic event before. It had always been dominated by the Soviet Union or Romania. So us winning this event was like a really huge moment for the United States to do that. And then, of course, the other big moment that comes that really helped define the emergence of women's sports during the 1990s is, of course, the 1999 Women's World Cup that the U.S. women won in overtime shootout. And again, winning the championship in a sport helps to not only popularize soccer, but particularly girls soccer, to make that really prominent sport in America. And this changes, and this really helps change, the emphasis on sports to be more inclusive of women. Yeah, Title IX had been around since the 70s, but in the 1990s is really where you start to see women's participation in athletics, particularly sports like soccer and basketball, really start to grow tremendously. I mentioned before that because of the strike in 1994, baseball lost a lot of popularity. In 1998, it would start to gain it back because of the 1998 home run chase between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. The all-time record in baseball for home runs in the season was 61, and it was a record that people thought would never be broken. It was set by Roger Maris in 1961, and for most of the season, you had three guys, these two, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, and Ken Griffey Jr., that were on pace to break the record. Griffey kind of fell off the pace towards the end because he didn't use steroids like these guys did, but we didn't know that at the time. But this home run chase captivated America to see who was going to break the record and who was going to win. Ultimately, Mark McGwire would break the record and finish the season with 70 home runs. It was like September 7th, September 5th, something like that in 98. Sammy Sosa would finish with 66 home runs and become the only player in baseball history to have 3 seasons of 60 home runs or more. This really helps to rejuvenate interest and love in the game of for the game of baseball, and helps to repair some of the negative feelings that people had about baseball because of um, because of the strike in '94. All right, so some of the big athletes of the '90s. I'm not even going to mention Michael Jordan because he's way bigger than everybody else, and we talked about him in the 1980s already. So that's why you don't see Jordan pictured here. I'm going to give you a few more of the big names. Where I'm going to put Michael Jordan on there again. So we already know enough about him. He's certainly, without question, the biggest name in the 1990s for my money and anybody with any brains. He's the best basketball player that ever lived, and maybe the best athlete ever. Other big names in the 1990s. And again, another thing to understand about these guys is they're all super marketable. These guys have big contracts, like Michael Jordan with Nike and other guys with Nike and things like that. You see these athletes all over the place. Ken Griffey Jr. was a Nike guy. Jerry Rice was a Nike guy. Charles Barkley was a Nike guy. Deion was a Nike guy. I got a pair of Deion Sanders shoes still. 1996 Air Max Diamond Turf, DT Max 96. Tiger Woods, of course, is a Nike guy. He emerges in the 1990s, becoming the youngest guy ever to win the Masters. So he certainly he wins his first two majors, the '97 Masters and the '99 PGA Championship, and he's well on his way to becoming a dominant athletic figure, arguably the most dominant athletic figure of the 2000s. So you got Michael Jordan, you got Tiger Woods. Deion Sanders was a big name throughout much of the decade. He kind of took over for Bo Jackson as a two-sport athlete. He's the only guy ever to play in a World Series game and a NFL football game in the same day. He was a great cornerback and is a Hall of Famer. Compared to Bo Jackson, who also played two sports, Deion Sanders was probably, or Bo Jackson was definitely a lot better at baseball, arguably better at football, but Deion was a really good football player as a cornerback and probably one of the best all time at that position. And he was extremely marketable and flashy. The 90s represent an era where athletes are much more flashy and noticeable than they'd ever been in the past. The best baseball player of the 1990s is probably Ken Griffey Jr., Cincinnati product. His best years, he was so good in the 1990s that I believe that guys started using steroids because they wanted to catch up with Ken Griffey Jr. He had swagger when he would hit a home run. He was a great player. He never had any connections with anything shady like steroids or anything like that. And well recognized, certainly as one of the best of his era, if not the best. Jerry Rice, the best receiver in NFL history. He's certainly, most likely the most dominant football player of the 1990s. He holds the NFL record all time for most career touchdowns. The only player to ever have more than 200 touchdowns in his career. So he stands out for a variety of reasons. Obviously, Shaq. Shaq breaks out in the scene in the 1990s. Hakeem Olajuwon was another great football player, or I'm sorry, NBA player during the time period. But Shaq breaks out, and he's another guy that's immediately marketable. When Michael Jordan retires briefly, really a lot of the marketing focus in the NBA goes to Shaq rather than some of these other guys like Charles Barkley, which upset some of the older school NBA guys at the time. Cal Ripken Jr., who's not pictured here, was one of the great baseball players. He played in every baseball game in the entire decade of the 1990s, setting the record for almost every game. He sat out a few towards the end of the decade, but he set the record for consecutive games played at 2,000, like 532 or something like that, 2,531. Without sitting out a single game. Not only was he really good and durable in playing every game, but he was also a really great player. Charles Barkley is another example of a great NBA player from the decade. He was extremely successful. There's a lot of good NBA guys I could throw in here. Probably the most notable female athlete of the decade is Mia Hamm, who was the leader of the women's soccer, U.S. women's soccer team in 1999. as well as when they won in 1991. She would be kind of like like the Alex Morgan of the 90s. Very marketable, got a lot of endorsements and commercials, and was also well regarded as a great soccer player. You also have, finally here, Evander Holyfield. Uh, some would argue that there's others that came later, but Evander Holyfield is probably the last great heavyweight champion. And he's kind of the last of the really marketable, popular boxers. Holyfield was champion throughout much of the early 90s when Mike Tyson was in jail for rape and or sexual assault or whatever. And Holyfield took over, was really a dominant boxer of the era. He's won the title, the championship on like 4 or 5 separate occasions, more than anybody else has done it. And after Holyfield, boxing has kind of really fallen off in terms of popularity, especially with the rise of MMA. So I think that's it. We'll stop there for today. That's it on your Athletes of the 90s. See you.